Let's turn our attention to this final strategy for responding to these objections that have been raised historically against utilitarianism. So, some objections might be diffused by challenging the projections of net happiness involved in the objection as systematically biased against utilitarianism, as unrealistic, and so on. Some objections might be diffused by arguing that, in fact, the ethically consistent and diffusible position really is the position predicted by the utilitarian, even though it runs counter to our ordinary notions or our ethical intuitions or our emotional reactions to those cases. But some cases might resist these strategies. And so the last mode of response that Rachel talks about is when ethical utilitarians say, I think there is a problem that this objection raises about the basic structure of my theory. So I'm going to try and change that basic structure in a way that excludes those cases that seem problematic while maintaining the core inside of my theory. So I'm going to modify my theory structure to hopefully exclude the cases that seem problematic without affecting the judgments and core intuitions that drive my theory. So, for example, suppose that you don't think free riders are such a good idea. And suppose you look at cases like people who cheat on their taxes and are happy because they don't get caught, or people who violate the rights of others and because they don't get caught and they're happy as a result of their violations, they seem to be morally praiseworthy for their actions. You look at cases like that, individual cases where somehow the greatest good is accomplished by this action that looks ethically suspect. Well, how might you exclude those individual cases? One strategy would be to switch the basic unit of evaluation for those cases, for evaluation of the ethical standing generally, but maintaining that utilitarian perspective about what makes something good, namely its net production of happiness. You can do that by switching to what's called rule utilitarianism. So how does that work? Well, act utilitarianism is classical utilitarianism. It evaluates an individual act on the basis of its utility, on the basis of its net production of happiness. And so in cases where an action seems to produce the greatest good for the greatest number, but it looks morally suspect, what one can do is think about whether or not, if people operated like that generally, the greatest good for the greatest number would be produced. And so you can adopt a rule perspective. And so rule utilitarianism will look at those individual actions and evaluate their ethical standing, not on the basis of what in this isolated case that action produces as consequences, but instead whether or not that action is an instance of a rule that, if generally adopted, would produce the greatest good for the greatest number. And so it changes how individual actions get evaluated, but it preserves this idea that ethical standing is linked to the production of happiness exclusively and exhaustively. And so individual actions now, their ethical standing is determined by whether or not they are consistent with or instances of rules. And the rules get their ethical standing exclusively and exhaustively by their propensity to produce the greatest good for the greatest number when people follow those rules. And so rule utilitarianism then determines the ethical status of individual actions by their consistency with general rules, and evaluates the ethical status of these rules by their propensity to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. So if we think about individual actions, so for instance, when Bill Clinton said, I did not have sex with that woman, he might have been doing his ethical calculations as an act utilitarian. He might have thought to himself, right, how should I respond to this question? How should I respond to these accusations? Should I lie about Monica? Should I lie in this particular case? And Bill Clinton might have thought, that's going to create the greatest good for the greatest number. I'm going to avoid getting in trouble. Monica is going to be severely affected. Congress's overall happiness won't be decreased that much. Hence, it will be the best net happiness outcome. But a rule utilitarian would look at Bill Clinton's action and say, wait a minute now, Bill. If you want to determine the ethical standing of your lie about your relationship with Monica Lewinsky, you have to look at it as an instance of a general rule. And that general rule would probably be something like, should you lie to avoid getting into trouble if you think you can get away with it? And that general rule, if followed by people, would result in net unhappiness. And if everybody lied whenever it would benefit them, then trust would be eroded, the ability to engage in information exchange and so on. They would all be eroded, and hence the net happiness that results from acting in accordance with that as a rule would be negative, and it can't be a legitimate rule. Hence, any instance of it can't be a legitimate action. So, act utilitarianism thinks about the ethical status of an act in relationship to its ability in that instant to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. Rule utilitarianism looks at that act and determines its ethical standing by determining what rule it's an instance of. So what rule is the rule that this action is consistent with? And does that rule, if adopted as a general rule, promote the greatest good for the greatest number? So to change from act to rule utilitarianism, you're changing the unit that gets evaluated. Its ethical status is determined exclusively and exhaustively by happiness. It's now the rules that get their status that way. The acts no longer directly get their status that way. They get their status by being instances of those rules. But there's another change in how you think about happiness that you have to adopt if you want to become a rule utilitarian. So if you want to become a rule utilitarian, you can't look at the actual outcomes, because a rule is going to be evaluated not just on the outcomes in this case or that case or the cases to date, but in terms of its general propensity to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. It's expected outcomes. So instead of judging utility based on the actual outcomes of individual actions, now we're going to be judging utility based on the pattern of outcomes that you can reasonably expect if people follow this rule in all the relevant cases. And so you switch from actual outcomes to theoretic, projected, expected, likely outcomes if you switch to a rule utilitarian framework.